Hello everyone, welcome back to another painting tutorial video. In this video I will show you how I painted the Palanquin for the Mortis Engine. It is the first part of 4 videos, so let's just jump into it. Here is the list of colors that I'm going to be using for part 1. I have the Palanquin assembled except the front gate and the reliquary, and primed them with Mechanicus standard grey. So the first color I'm going to use is Nuln oil wash, and with the first coat I covered the whole surface of the Palanquin except the staircase and the reliquary. So just make sure that I have the all even covered wash on the surface. Also making sure that the front gate as well is covered with this wash. Once the wash is completely dry, now I'm applying a second layer and I'm turning upside down the Palanquin. I'm using the gravity for the wash, so I want the top parts more darker, so for this way I let the wash flow on the top. I do the same for the cage door as well, around halfway, making sure that I have a nice even wash. Once this wash as well is dried, now I'm adding a third layer, and this time I'm focusing more towards the edge of the tip. So I just want to make a nice blending from light to dark. And adding a final layer on each of the tip of the cage, so I have a nice smooth transition. The next color I'm going to use is Agtrax Earthshade Wash, and sadly my camera decided not to record it, so as you can see I covered the staircase and also around halfway of each of the lanterns, the bones areas. Once the wash is completely dry, now I'm going back to Mechanicus Standard Grey, and with a small dry brush I start dry brushing all the Palanquin bone areas, also around halfway around the cage, just to have a little bit of transition, that from the top dark and then from the bottom a bit lighter. Also the lantern bones and also the bone gate. I leave out the stone stairs. Now I'm using Dawnstone And again with the same dry brush technique, this time a little bit more focused on just some of the most raised areas, a lighter dry brush just to give a nice transition of highlight. Now I'm going to use Karak stone and again just dry brush, but this time I'm mainly focusing on each of the bone, skeleton, bones, just to have a nice transition. And also in some of the random areas where you can see that is like still looks like a bone, just to have that nice transition. And finally with Zandri dust, again I use dry brush technique. I give a nice dry brush on each of the skeletons and a lighter, smaller amount of dry brush just where around the bone is, so that it's having a nice highlight and it's gonna be blending together from gray to sort of a dirty bone. Now I'm going to leave them aside and I focus with the staircase, so I'm gonna use now Athonian Camoshade. And mainly what I'm trying to do now is I just grab a brush and just dab it in some of the random areas. I want to give a nice weathered look onto the stone staircase. Now I'm gonna use again Mechanicus standard gray and just start dry brushing the staircase, so that with the previous wash of the Athonian Camoshade it's gonna be giving a nice moldy effect onto the staircase. Now I'm gonna use Dawnstone and even a lighter dry brush onto the staircases, mainly on the edges and some of the raised stones. Also, let's not forget the reliquary as well. The stone areas, I'm doing the same technique. Now I'm going to use Administratum Grey as a highlight for the staircase, so it will give a nice difference from the bones, and just make an edge highlight on the staircase. Now that the stone staircase is done, I am going back to focus on the skeletons and the skulls that are underneath the staircase and also underneath the Palanquin. I am using Zandri dust as a base color for the skulls and also applying it on the skeleton lanterns just to give it a bit more bone effect on the areas. Also, let's not forget the hands on the front gate as well. Now that I have all the bone areas base painted, I am using Agtrax Earthshade wash and applying it on the skulls under the staircase and also underneath the Palanquin. I leave out the skeleton lanterns. Once the wash is completely dry, now I'm going to use Morghast bone, and with a small dry brush, I use a very old brush that I don't mind using it for this technique. I start dry brushing all the skulls underneath the staircase and also the ones that are underneath the Palanquin. Now I'm going to use a small layer brush and start highlighting the skull's eye sockets and cheekbones, the jaws. I also highlight the skeleton lantern's skulls and their collarbones as well. So I'm building up a nice transition from grey stone to almost bone on the Palanquin. And finishing it with Screaming Skull, I base paint all the teeth on each of the skulls. Now I'm going to focus on a little bit of the thorns, so I start base painting them with Death World Forest. Also, let's not forget the reliquary as well has some veins on them, so I also base paint those as well. Now I'm going to use Athonian Camoshade wash and apply it on all the Death World Forest areas. Give a nice earthy thorn look. Now I am going to focus on the glowing reliquary. I'm going to use Kabalite green as a first color. As you can see, I painted the same way the stone area, just as the staircase, the skulls, like the bones, and the thorns as well. And now I am base painting all the candles with Kabalite green. I also base paint the hourglass that is behind on the reliquary. The next color is White Scar, and with a small dry brush I start dabbing onto the hourglass, the candles, and it can also go onto the bones and in some of the stone areas where I want the glowing to seen on the reliquary. I also use a small layer brush and I dilute the White Scar so it flows onto the recesses where the locks are. Now I'm going to use Nihiliakh oxide, and with a small dry brush, again I start dabbing onto the areas where I can still see like a nice transition from Kabalite green to White Scar, so just to give a nice definition and transition. Now I'm going to use Tesseract Glow Technical, and with a medium shade brush I start applying it onto the whole surface except the bottom stone part, but also with a tiny touch amount I'm giving it onto the lower area as well, because it turns out it really gives a nice glowing effect, which I'm actually looking for. Making sure that everywhere is evenly covered and nowhere is collected all together. Once the Tesseract Glow is completely dry, I'm going back to use White Scar, and with a small dry brush I give a gentle dry brush on some of the areas where I think the light hits the most, or that it's like glowing. Now that I'm happy with the result, I'm going to use a small layer brush and just fine highlight in some of the most raised areas. Don't need too much, just a little bit, especially around the hourglass, just to make it look like it's glowing, and also some of the top raised areas of the candles. Now I'm going to use a diluted Coelia Greenshade wash with Lahmian medium, a 3:1 mix ratio, and just giving it into some of the areas just to have a even better transition and blend. Now I'm going to focus on the flames. The first color I'm going to use is White Scar, and I start base painting each of the flames with a small layer brush. And because my reliquary, I want to have it glowing, I'm using an old brush and a very gentle dry brush with White Scar on the inside of the cage, just to have a bit of more highlight to it. Also, let's not forget the inside of the front gate as well. Make sure that it's the inside, not on the outside. Now I'm going to use Incubi Darkness, and with a small layer brush I start base painting the tip of each flames. I want to have a nice transition again, so I'm going to use Nihiliakh oxide, and I start applying just a little bit amount where the Incubi Darkness and the white scar meets. Now I'm going to use again Tesseract Glow, and this paint is just amazing. I am very happy about the result of how the flames are going to turn out. So I start applying it onto the flames, and also adding a very little amount, just a touch that like your brush barely has any, just a little bit on the top of each skull. So to give a nice glowing bright effect on the green flames. Now, because I base painted also with the small dry brush inside the cage, now I'm applying over there as well some Tesseract Glow, because my reliquary is going to be glowing, so I want to have a bright color inside, and just applying it onto the areas, and also from the outside just some of the edges of each of the bone areas. The same goes to the front cage as well. All that white dry brushed areas, I apply this Tesseract Glow. Don't need too much, sometimes less is more, and it's still gonna give the effect very nicely. Now I'm going to use again a Coelia Greenshade mixed with Lahmian Medium, a 1:1 part ratio, and again I use Gravity. So I have the miniature upside down, and just the tip of each flame where the Incubi Darkness still shows, just to have a nicer transition. I apply it. Now I'm going back to the thorns and also the roses. So the thorns, first I start layering it with Elysian green. Now the thorns are complete. I'm going to use Naggaroth Night as a base color for the roses. I give it a wash with Nuln oil, so I apply it on all the Naggaroth Night areas, trying to be careful where the thorns are. Once the wash is completely dry, I use a small layer brush and start highlighting the roses with Daemonette hide. Now obviously the Palanquin has quite a lot of metal areas as well, and I want to give it a rusted effect to it. So the first color I'm going to use is Doombull brown and start base painting all the metal areas. Now I'm going to use Ryza Rust dry paint. If you do not have it, then also Troll Slayer Orange as well does the job. So I start dry brushing all the Doombull brown painted areas. Now, because I'm dry brushing, I am trying to be as neat as possible where the areas are already painted, not to go over to it. Following it with Leadbelcher. Again, I use dry brush technique and start dry brushing mainly from the top to have a nice highlight already to the rusted metal. And with some Stormhost silver, with my trusty old brush, I give a very gentle little amount onto each metal areas. Now I'm going to use Vallejo Wash Light Rust and applying a little amount onto each of the metal areas, so it's really giving a nice rusted effect. If you do not have this wash, also Fungian Orange as well does the job. Once the light rust wash is completely dry, I finish the metals with the fine highlight of Stormhost silver. I add on to the sharpest features and also paint the pins as well. Also making sure that the inside of the front gate chains as well are highlighted with Stormhost silver. And once it is finished, I can glue the reliquary and the front gate onto its place. Now I'm going to focus on the lanterns. So I'm going to use white Scar as a base paint. And as you can see, I did mainly the same technique, method, how the metals are, and I'm just base painting each of the glass areas with white Scar. Now I'm going to apply Tesseract Glow, where I base painted with white Scar. I also apply a very light amount of Tesseract Glow onto the lower part of the Palanquin, where the lanterns are, so that to have a glowing effect onto them as well. And finishing it with a mix of Coelia Greenshade and Lahmian medium, a 1:1 part ratio. I do a recess shade. I apply it on the lower section and some onto the right angle, just to give a bit of more definition. Now the only thing left are the parchments. So the first color I'm going to use on them is Zandri Dust as a base color. So I start base painting all the parchments. Now I'm going to give it a wash with Agtrax Earthshade, and I am not applying it very neatly. I want to have the wash to give more contrast in the more visible areas. Now I'm going to use Rakarth Flash and start dry brushing the parchments. Following it with a small layer brush and start also layering some of the parchments. Now I'm going to use Flayed 1 Flash and start to give a fine highlight onto the parchments. And finishing it with Abaddon black, I dilute the color with water so it flows easily. And with some extra small brush, I start painting some random writings and symbols onto the pages. And with that, the Palanquin is finished. I am really happy with the Tesseract Glow paint. Turns out you can paint other things as well, not just Necron energy weapons. I will see you all in part 2, where I will be painting the Corpse Master. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, hit the like button if you enjoyed this tutorial, and click on the bell button to be notified about future video tutorials. Thanks for watching, cheers!